The ocean at night does not forgive mistakes. It was a moonless night somewhere in the warm waters of the southern seas. The sky above was a deep, endless black, and the stars were hidden behind a thick cover of clouds. There was no wind. The water was flat and still, like a dark mirror stretched out in every direction. It was the kind of night that made a man feel very small and very alone. Most people, if they were placed in that water at that hour, would panic within minutes. The darkness below the surface is total, a darkness that has no bottom, no edges, and no sound except the slow movement of water around a human body. 6 men moved below the surface of that water. They wore black suits that covered them from head to toe, and they breathed through special devices that produced no bubbles. No sound. No trace. They were Navy SEALs, the most highly trained special operations soldiers in the world, and they moved through the water the way shadows move through a dark room, quietly, smoothly, without any effort that could be seen from above. The mission was simple, the way the best plans always look simple on paper. A man named Colonel Rashid had been moving weapons through the southern sea routes for nearly 3 years. He did this regularly, under the cover of darkness, using old civilian-looking vessels so that nobody would suspect anything. He supplied small armed groups across 3 countries. Those groups caused a great deal of harm to a great many people. Intelligence teams had been watching him for over a year, collecting information, building a picture, waiting for the right moment. Tonight was the right moment. His boat would be on the water. The team would stop it. 5 of the 6 men were moving in a tight formation toward the target vessel. The 6th man, however, had fallen behind. Not because he was struggling. Not because something had gone wrong. He fell behind on purpose. He always did. His name was Chief Petty Officer Dane Calloway. His teammates called him Mermaid. Nobody gave him that nickname to be kind. At first, it was a joke, the kind of joke that forms naturally in a unit of competitive, tough men who are always looking for something to tease each other about. Dane spent more time underwater than any other man in the unit. While others preferred helicopters, fast boats, and the satisfaction of landing hard and fast on a target, Dane always chose the water. He was more comfortable beneath the surface than anywhere else. He could hold his breath longer than any man any of his teammates had ever tested. He moved through water with an ease that did not look entirely human. So they called him Mermaid, and they laughed when they said it, and he let them laugh because he did not care what they called him. He only cared about doing his job well. But nobody laughed anymore. Not after what they had seen him do over the years. The name had changed meaning, the way nicknames sometimes do. It started as a joke and became something like a title. Something close to respect. Dane moved alone in the dark water, 40 meters behind his team, with a long rifle sealed inside a waterproof covering strapped tightly to his back. His job was not to go with the others to the target. His job was different. His job was to stay behind, stay hidden, stay ready. If anything went wrong, if an ambush was waiting, if the enemy had more information than the intelligence suggested, if something broke in a direction nobody had predicted, Dane would be the answer to that problem. He would surface where nobody expected, from a position that should have been empty water, and he would fix what was broken. He had done it before. Almost perfectly. 6 months earlier, in a different body of water, on a different mission, Dane had been in exactly this position. His team had approached a coastal target, and the enemy had been ready and waiting. The ambush came fast and loud. Dane had been in the water, positioned correctly, with a clear picture of the threat. He had his target in his view. But something made him wait a half-second too long. He could never fully explain it afterward, maybe a flicker of doubt, maybe an instinct to be certain before acting, maybe just a momentary hesitation that meant nothing and cost everything. That half-second was enough. His teammate, a young man named Rivera, was struck before Dane could respond. Rivera survived. But he never came back to the team. His right side was damaged in a way that could not be fully repaired, and the career he had worked his entire adult life to build was over at the age of 29. He went home to his family in San Antonio, and Dane visited him once, and they sat on a porch and talked about ordinary things, and neither of them mentioned what had happened on the water. They did not need to. Dane had not missed a shot since that night. But he had also never fully put down the weight of that half-second. It traveled with him everywhere, quiet and patient, the way a small stone in a shoe travels with a man on a long walk, not always painful, but always there. Tonight, he carried it with him into the water. And tonight, it was going to change. The target vessel came into view through the darkness ahead. Dane could sense the shift in the water around him as his team drew close to the hull, slight movements, pressure changes, the careful adjustments of trained bodies approaching a large object in still water. The vessel sat quietly, no lights showing, riding low and heavy. Everything looked exactly as the briefing had described. Everything felt right. Then the lights came on. Not one light. Every light. Powerful floodlights mounted along the dock structure beside the vessel blazed to life all at once and turned the dark water into something pale and exposed. In the same instant, the sharp crack of gunfire came from 3 separate directions, from the elevated dock to the left, from a position behind a cargo pile on the right, and from the deck of the vessel itself. The ambush had been carefully prepared. Colonel Rashid had not simply guessed that a team might come by water. He had studied the patterns. He had spoken to people who understood how these operations were planned. He had positioned his fighters a full day in advance so they could wait without being noticed. He had turned the team's strength, their silent approach through the water, into the very thing that brought them directly into his trap. 2 of the SEALs were hit in the opening seconds of the ambush. The remaining 3 pulled back immediately, using a smaller civilian boat docked nearby as cover. Lieutenant Commander Ray Holt, Ghost, took in the situation in a single breath and made his assessment. Radio equipment damaged. 2 men down. 3 shooters at known positions. Cover that would not hold forever. Time running out. He pressed his team close to the hull of the civilian boat and began to think through the options, and none of them were good. 40 meters back in the water, Dane felt the battle before he heard it clearly. The concussions from the gunfire traveled through the water as heavy, muffled thuds, slow and deep, like a large drum being struck somewhere far away. He felt them through his chest. He counted them. He understood their meaning. He did not surface. He moved forward. With no light and no clear sight line, Dane navigated entirely by sound and by the faint visual pulses that the muzzle flashes created above the surface, brief blooms of pale light visible through the water if you knew what you were looking for. He tracked those pulses the way a man tracks lightning in a distant storm, noting direction, estimating distance, building a mental map of what was happening above him in the world of air and noise and danger. He found the first position. Then the second. Then the third. He held the map in his mind and moved toward the angle that gave him access to all 3 in the shortest possible time. Patient, exact, unhurried. The water around him was warm. His breathing was slow. There was nothing in his mind except the task. He surfaced once. He chose a spot in the deep shadow behind a thick support pylon that held up the dock structure above. He let 6 inches of his face come above the waterline, eyes only, just enough, and he stayed there for 4 seconds. 4 seconds to confirm everything he had calculated from below. The 3 positions. The angles. The distances. The way the floodlights fell and where the shadows were deepest. Then he went back under, as quietly as a leaf settling on still water. Ghost was working hard to hold the situation together. Torres, a veteran with 8 years of this kind of work behind him, had taken a round in the shoulder and was operating on determination alone. He held his weapon with one arm and kept his eyes forward and did not complain. Ghost checked their remaining supplies and did not share the number he reached. Some information helps no one. A voice came through a megaphone from the direction of the target vessel. It was calm and clear. "You have 30 seconds, the voice said, speaking English with a measured accent. 30 seconds to put down your weapons. After that, we will not ask again." Ghost looked at the dark water behind him. Nothing visible. No sign of anything. He knew Dane was out there, or he had been, before all of this started. He did not know if his man was still alive. He had no way to find out. He just held on to what he knew about Dane Calloway, that the water was where he was most at home, and that if he was alive, he was already working. Ghost trusted that. It was all he had. The seconds passed. 20. 15. 10. Colonel Rashid, standing at the edge of the upper deck with the megaphone in his hand, raised his right arm slowly to signal the final order. His fighters saw the gesture. They prepared themselves. 5 seconds. The fighter on the deck of the target vessel, the one standing closest to the water's edge, sat down without a sound and did not get back up. There was no warning. No noise that anyone could identify. He was simply there, and then he was not. 1 second of complete silence fell over the water. Then everything changed. The enemy fighters looked at each other. They looked at the water. They looked at the dock. They looked in every direction and could not find a source for what had just happened. The silence was more frightening than any sound would have been. When you cannot find where a threat is coming from, your mind begins to make it much larger than it is. The colonel's fighters began firing into the water, into the shadows, at positions that held nothing. Fear had taken over where discipline had been. Ghost heard the single shot that had made no sound and felt something loosen in his chest. He turned to his team. Forward. Now. Push left and move. Dane was at the water's edge, half submerged, the lower half of his body still in the water while his upper body rested against the dock's base. The floodlights that had exposed his teammates so completely were now his greatest advantage. They lit the dock structure and the elevated positions from above, leaving the waterline, where Dane lay, in deep and useful darkness. He worked with the patience that had always been his greatest quality. Not hurry. Not emotion. Just the careful, steady removal of one problem at a time. The first fighter on the elevated dock came into his view. Dane placed his shot. The fighter was gone. 8 seconds passed in which he shifted his position slightly, let his breathing settle, and acquired the second elevated position. The second shot followed the first with the same quiet confidence. 2 positions cleared. The third fighter, who had watched both of his colleagues go down from locations he could not identify, made the reasonable decision to get low and stay there. The colonel's carefully designed ambush had become a ruin in under 90 seconds. Ghost and his team moved quickly now, using the confusion as cover, pushing along the dock toward the target vessel. Torres moved with them, jaw set, eyes tracking forward. The enemy fighters who had been so organized and so confident just 2 minutes ago were now calling out to each other in the dark, unable to locate the threat that was taking them apart one position at a time. Colonel Rashid felt the shape of the battle shift beneath him. He was an experienced man. He recognized the feeling, the moment when the plan stops working and the pressure begins to move in the wrong direction. He stepped out from behind his cover and moved toward the outer edge of the vessel's upper deck to see the water for himself. He needed to understand what was out there. He needed to take back control. Dane saw him the moment his outline appeared against the pale light. 67 meters. A slight current moved beneath him, pulling gently from the left. He felt it against his body and made the small adjustment without thinking, the kind of correction that becomes automatic after years of practice in water, in cold, in wind, in every difficult condition a man can train himself to work through. He breathed in slowly and let half of it go. He thought, briefly and without sorrow, of Rivera on that porch in San Antonio. Of the way they had talked about nothing important and how that had been exactly right. Of the half-second he had been carrying for 6 months, quietly and without complaint, the way good men carry the things they cannot change. He let it go now. Completely. Finally. He did not wait. The shot connected. The colonel stepped back from the railing. He did not return to it. What remained of the opposing force, without their leader, without 2 of their 3 firing positions, firing into shadows and water for reasons they could no longer clearly explain, came apart entirely. Some moved away from the vessel quickly. Some went very still and did not raise their weapons again. Nobody kept fighting. The battle, which Colonel Rashid had designed with such care over so many weeks, ended 4 minutes after Dane fired his first shot. 4 minutes. It is a very short time for something so large to end. Dane pulled himself fully out of the water and onto the dock. His suit streamed water across the old wooden planks. He stood and took one slow look around at the dock, the vessel, the positions that were no longer occupied. Then he secured his equipment and walked toward his team without rushing. Torres saw him first. The man stared for a full 2 seconds, then shook his head the way people do when they see something that does not seem entirely real. "Where were you?" he asked. "In the water," Dane said. Torres repeated it quietly to himself. "In the water." He said it the way a person repeats a phrase they want to remember. Ghost crossed to Dane and stood in front of him. He looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he put one hand firmly on Dane's shoulder and held it there for a few seconds. Between those two men, who had worked alongside each other through more difficult nights than most people will ever know, that gesture said everything a long speech could not have improved. Dane understood it completely. They cleared the vessel. They handled the situation. A helicopter arrived 18 minutes later. While they waited, Dane sat at the edge of the dock with his feet hanging over the water below. The floodlights had been switched off. The sea was dark again, calm and wide, the way it had been before any of this started. Ghost came and sat beside him after a while. They looked at the water together without speaking for a moment. "You good?" Ghost asked. The same two words he always used. Before missions and after them. A small, simple question that carried more weight than it appeared to. Dane looked at the water for a long time before he answered. He watched the small, slow movements of the surface, the way it caught the faintest trace of distant light and turned it into something soft and dark. He had spent half his life in water like this, warm water, cold water, rough water, still water, and it had always felt like where he belonged. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like something had been settled down there in the dark, quietly and without any ceremony, the way the most important things usually are. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I am." He meant it. Not as something he was telling himself to feel better. Not as a thing he hoped would slowly become true with enough time. He meant it with the full weight of a man who has finally set down something heavy after carrying it for far too long. The memory of Rivera, the half-second, the porch in San Antonio, those things were still there, the way memories always are. But they no longer lived inside him like an open wound. They had become part of the long record of what this kind of life cost and gave back in equal measure. The helicopter came low over the water with its light sweeping the surface below. The team loaded in. Torres, arm-wrapped and held close, looked across the cargo area at Dane with wide, quiet eyes and nodded slowly, the nod of a man who already knew he would be telling this story for the rest of his life to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear it. Dane gave him a small nod back. The helicopter lifted and turned out over the open sea. Dane looked through the small window at the water below as it grew distant. It spread in every direction in the darkness, enormous and unbroken, keeping its silence the way deep water always has and always will. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Calm. Patient. Empty. He watched it until the clouds moved between them and there was nothing left to see. The debriefers received a complete and accurate account of the night. Every fact was documented carefully. The timeline, the positions, the decisions, the outcomes, all of it was recorded and filed where such records are kept. But the part that was most difficult to put into words, the particular feeling of a threat appearing from the water itself, from the dark, from a place that should have contained nothing, at the exact moment it was most needed, that part never quite made it into any official document. It lived only in the memory of the 5 men who were on that dock. Some things belong to the water. And the water, as anyone who has spent real time in it will tell you, keeps what it is given.